He spent decades in silence, but on his final night, the words slipped through cracked lips like a prayer meant for no one. What he saw above Tonopah wasn't ours, and now, whatever it was, it's coming back. The machines hummed in their usual rhythm, the beeping, the breathing, the low whir of filtered air. Room 17 in the veterans' wing of Reno General wasn't expecting anything other than a quiet death. He had slipped in and out of morphine sleep for days, name redacted, files sealed, a face unrecognizable to anyone under 60. But just before dawn, with his voice almost eaten by the oxygen mask, he leaned toward the nurse and said it. "We took it apart. It wasn't ours." She paused, thinking it was delirium. Then he gripped her wrist, not hard, but deliberate, and repeated it, slower this time. "We took it apart. Not ours, not human." His pupils dilated, his heart skipped, and then the machines screamed. The nurse, a former Air Force medic herself, pressed record on her phone. She didn't know why. Instinct, maybe. Or maybe something darker stirred when she heard the way he said, "Not human." Like it wasn't a metaphor. The hospital marked it down as cardiac arrest due to age and complications. No family claimed him. The military sent 2 men in plain clothes who removed his personal effects within the hour. The nurse's phone was confiscated, but she had already sent the audio to her brother. And he, after listening to it 37 times in a dark basement in Henderson, forwarded it to a podcast. The audio was published, then deleted, then scrubbed. Even archive links were broken within 24 hours, but the voice lived. It reached others. One former contractor in Los Alamos, who hadn't heard that phrase, "We took it apart," since a desert briefing in 1978. A woman in Montana who claimed her grandfather drew the same words in chalk on the floor before disappearing for good. And a pilot in Arizona who woke up screaming the name Tonopah over and over. Something in those 5 words unlatched doors in people who had buried things decades ago. People who had signed things, been shown things, who'd lied to family, to lovers, to themselves. And now, for the first time, they heard it said aloud in the voice of a man who had nothing left to lose. Not a story, not a theory. A confession. At the edge of death, the whisper was a spark. It didn't go viral. It went quiet. Viral can be tracked. Quiet spreads in places no algorithm sees. And that was exactly how it was designed to begin. Again. In the fall of 1979, the Mojave sky was so clear you could see the scars of old wars written in starlight. That night, Creech Air Force Base was quiet, at least on the surface. No drills, no flyovers, just the still hum of lights across the sand. But at 0200 hours, something appeared. No engine, no wind. Just silence stitched in black. It hovered low and wide, a triangle darker than the night behind it, edges so sharp they seemed to cut the air itself. And from its underside light, not beams, not flares, it was bleeding. Thin, vertical lines of red light dripped downward, suspended, but never touching the ground. The red wasn't like anything seen in standard aircraft, not LED, not laser. It pulsed like it was alive. The tower crew said nothing. They watched, then turned away. One man reached for his radio, stopped halfway, and lowered it. Every instinct screamed that this was not for them. Not tonight, not ever. But one man, Staff Sergeant Dale Renner, kept watching. He tracked it on radar, watched the signatures split and merge, like 3 crafts stitched into one skin. The blip warped the scale. Altitude readings folded into negative numbers. At 0243, he entered a line of code into the radar console standard procedure for registering anomalies. The system crashed. And then the room got cold. Not physically, existentially. That's how the others described it. A cold, not of temperature, but of presence, as if something was watching them from inside the frequency. The triangle hovered for 11 more minutes, then tilted slightly and blinked out. Not accelerated, not cloaked, just gone. The next morning, Dale didn't report for shift. His car was still in the lot, locker untouched, his name still on the schedule. They searched for 3 days before declaring him AWOL. His file was sealed by an agency that didn't exist in base records. His mother in Idaho said she received a final letter typed, unsigned, saying he was being reassigned to a weather station near the Arctic Circle, but no such station existed. The return address was blank. Years later, in a batch of declassified drone testing files, one image briefly surfaced, overexposed, half-burned, showing a black triangle above Nevada desert, with tendrils of crimson light. The caption read, "Test subject, echo unstable, light leakage, not to be used over populated areas." The file was gone within hours, but not before one archivist whispered to another, "That looks just like what we saw over Creech." And the other man, pale, older, already shaking, replied, "We weren't supposed to remember." In the spring of 1984, a weather satellite passing over southern Nevada captured something that shouldn't have been there. A long, pale stripe across the dry basin near Groom Lake. A runway, pristine and smooth, perfectly aligned with no visible support structures. But it wasn't in any previous pass. The photo the day before showed nothing but cracked desert and salt, and the next image, taken 24 hours later, showed the same. Just empty sand, no tracks, no dust, no runway. Analysts at the National Reconnaissance Office flagged it, not for concern, but confusion. They assumed it was a glitch, maybe reflection, maybe a film defect. But someone printed the photo anyway, tucked it into a beige folder marked with 3 letters that no longer match any known department. The only handwritten note said, "Mirage?" Over the next 2 years, the same phenomenon repeated, not always in the same place, not always the same size, but always the same pattern. A runway that appeared for a single satellite cycle and then vanished completely. No associated buildings, no lights, just a stretch of asphalt that shouldn't exist. Pilots began whispering about it. Not formally, not in flight logs, but in hangars, in bars, in quiet hallways near water fountains. They called it the Mirage Runway. Some said it was an optical overlay, a projection only visible to infrared satellites. Others said it wasn't a projection at all, but a phase-shifted structure real, but only briefly aligned with our dimension. A doorway for something that didn't want to land where it could be seen. One retired pilot, who flew recon missions over Nevada in 1987, claimed he saw the runway with his own eyes. He described it as wrong flat. Not just smooth, but dimensionless, like looking at a shadow on paper. He said he tried to descend toward it, just to get a better look, but his instruments froze mid-air. He was ordered to return to base immediately. That night, he was visited by 2 men in civilian clothes who handed him a medical discharge and a check. He never flew again. In 2006, a private satellite company accidentally captured another image, 1 frame, 1 pass of the same stretch near Groom Lake. The pale line was back. But when enhanced, it showed something new. Shadows, 2 of them, long and narrow, like fins, but no craft in sight. The next day, the image disappeared from the database. And so did the server hosting it. The runway is never seen by day, never seen by ground. It leaves no physical trace, no thermal trail, no chemical markers. Just one truth that slips between the pixels. Something lands in Nevada that does not want to be found, and it brings its own runway with it. The box arrived 2 weeks after the pilot's death. No return address, no stamps, just a plain cardboard package left on the doorstep of a former journalist in Elko, Nevada. Inside, a folded flight suit, a rusted pair of dog tags, and a small leather-bound notebook that smelled like ozone and old engine oil. The journalist didn't recognize the name on the tags, but the notebook that was something else. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the diagrams were unmistakable. Not blueprints, not exactly. They were more like anatomical sketches, as if someone had dissected a machine and was trying to make sense of its organs. Curved structures that bent in on themselves, no visible engines, no exhaust. A sphere nested inside a ring, and the ring itself dotted with crystalline nodes. It looked more like biology than engineering, more like something that had grown than something that had been built. The captions were handwritten in what first appeared to be German, but not quite. There were too many spelling anomalies. Words twisted in ways that suggested either translation error or intentional code. The phrase, Körperlicht Antrieb, appeared more than once, roughly, body-light propulsion. Another term, Schnittpunktfeld, translated loosely to intersection field. No military manual ever used those terms. One page showed a human figure seated inside a cross-section of the craft. But the seat was wrong. It was upside down, suspended above the center as if the craft operated in an inverted gravity well. Beneath it, a phrase scrawled in red ink. Du steuerst mit dem Gedanken, nicht der Hand. You steer with thought, not with hand. Whoever had drawn this had seen something, or been inside something. A linguistic analyst in Munich was sent high-resolution scans. Her reply came 3 days later. This is not native German. It's constructed, like someone pretending, or learning from a textbook that doesn't exist here. The pilot's records showed no overseas deployments, no language training. His file was mostly redacted, but the final assignment listed him as consultant observer on a program labeled Blackweld, no description, no dates. Just a single location code tied to a long-defunct hangar near Groom Lake. The notebook's final page was blank, except for one burned-in circle etched so deeply it cut through to the back cover. A perfect ring, carbon-scorched, with 8 symmetrical dots orbiting its edge. No explanation, no caption, just that shape, like a seal. Or a warning. The journalist tried to scan the pages again the next day. The file corrupted instantly, and when he opened the notebook once more, the pages were blank. All of them, except the last. Still burned, still waiting. The desert didn't shake. There was no explosion, no fireball, no rising plume, just a tremor too low for seismographs, and a ripple in the silence that made birds stop flying. On October 9th, 1962, something came down just north of the Nevada Test Range's restricted Sector 7. They called it a crash, but no one ever saw it fall. It was just suddenly there, half submerged in the sand, humming. A single scout helicopter circled the site within 15 minutes. The pilot reported a metallic object roughly the size of a school bus, partially buried but intact. No smoke, no heat, no impact crater, and around it a perfect ring of stillness, not just quiet. Dead, lizards, rabbits, coyotes, all motionless. Their bodies showed no trauma, no burns, just eyes wide open, frozen in place. By the time the retrieval team arrived, they were issued gear they had never seen before. White suits sealed at the seams, not flame-resistant, not radiation-proof. Something else. The team lead, a chemical warfare veteran named Irwin Chase, later said the fabric felt too cold, even in that heat. Like wearing metal that was pretending to be fabric. The object itself was smooth, not aerodynamic in any traditional sense. No seams, no markings, except for one panel that reflected light in a way that made the sun look fractured. When they touched it, it pulsed. A low, bone-deep frequency that made the sand tremble in arcs. The Geiger counters went dead, literally, batteries drained in seconds. Within 4 hours, it was gone. Not lifted by crane, not dismantled, moved, quietly. No trucks, no dust trail. One moment it was there, the next, it wasn't. Irwin Chase never led another team. Within 6 months, He was retired with full honors and an undisclosed neurological deterioration. He spent the rest of his life painting the same shape, an oval with 3 concentric rings, each one darker than the last, always with a single black dot in the center. His wife burned the paintings when he died, said the paint never dried, even after years. Years later, an independent geologist surveying the same area found something odd. The soil beneath that site had a layer of fused silicate, no more than an inch thick like glass melted by heat, but only that single ring. No radiation, no meteor signature. No industrial residue, just a ghost of something that never left a mark. The report was filed under anomalies, misfiled, lost, then, mysteriously, redacted by an unnamed division within the Department of Energy. The only note attached said, "Containment successful, object relocated," but when asked where, no one answered. Only a low humming sound remained, buried, waiting. In the winter of 1972, Lockheed received a package that didn't come through customs, didn't have a manifest, and didn't go through any of the usual defense channels. It was flown in under heavy guard aboard an unmarked transport from Nevada, offloaded in total darkness at a hangar no one knew existed at the time beneath the Sierra Nevada foothills. Inside the crate, fragments. Metallic, dense, cold to the touch even in heated rooms. One piece shimmered in colors the human eye wasn't supposed to register, like oil underwater viewed through broken glass. The documents that accompanied the shipment weren't standard either. They weren't even stamped with the usual clearance codes. They used symbols instead, non-alphabetic, geometric. The memo inside simply read, "Not of domestic or Soviet origin. Reverse feasibility study authorized. Begin under Project Slumber." Project Slumber didn't exist in any Lockheed budget because it wasn't supposed to. The funding was routed through a fabricated program under the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, a series of fake weather satellite initiatives with names like Cloud Song and Rain Mirror. But no satellites were ever launched, no balloons, no tracking systems. Just invoices for materials nobody could explain, and contractors who never appeared on payrolls. One engineer, years later, said the first time he touched the metal, it whined. Not a sound, a feeling, like his bones resonated. Another described the fragment as impossible geometry. When viewed straight on, it appeared curved, but from the side, it became a triangle. No machining marks, no welds, just a kind of perfect seamlessness, as if it had been grown, not built. Most of the engineers believed it was an advanced Soviet drone. That's what they were told anyway. But the ones who had seen real Soviet parts knew better. The metallurgy didn't match anything on Earth. One sample contained a ratio of isotopes never found in natural deposits. Another was magnetically inert until exposed to body heat, then began aligning with the Earth's rotation. The first prototype Lockheed attempted to replicate from the fragments never lifted more than 6 inches off the ground, but it vibrated. Not from engine thrust, but something stranger. One technician said the hum it gave off made him dream of corridors, endless hallways of mirrored walls and low ceilings. He couldn't sleep for 3 days after. Project Slumber was officially shuttered in 1978, but the core team was moved, quietly, not to Area 51, somewhere deeper. Underground. The crate was never returned. The fragments were absorbed into a different program. Lockheed denied it all, of course, but in one declassified document, buried under layers of technical jargon, a single line stood out in plain English. "The object is not ours, not theirs. Recommend further study under biological frameworks." Biological, not mechanical. That was when the fear really started. His name was Carl, and he didn't talk much even before the trip. A quiet man, calculated, obsessed with airflows and curvature. The kind of engineer who could sketch an F-111 wing profile from memory and still know the weight of every bolt. In late May of 1983, Carl received a call from someone claiming to be from the Department of Energy, but it wasn't about energy. They needed him for something else. Something he wasn't allowed to ask about until after he signed. He was flown to a facility he didn't recognize. No signage, no runways. Just sand, shadows, and a door in the desert. He was told he'd be studying an aerodynamic anomaly. No photos, no specs, just a word, whispered with equal parts awe and fear. Anomaly. Carl was gone for 6 days. When he came back, he wasn't Carl anymore. Not fully. His wife said he walked like his joints didn't belong to him. He smiled too long, stared at the microwave like he was waiting for it to speak. But the worst part wasn't the staring or the silence. It was the forgetting. He forgot how to say Tuesday, not just pronounce it. He couldn't remember the concept. Every time someone mentioned it, he'd pause, blink, and tilt his head like he was trying to place the word in a language he no longer understood. Monday? Fine. Wednesday? No problem. But the day in between was gone, like someone had erased it from his mind and left a smudge. They took him to a neurologist. Scans were normal, no lesions, no trauma, but when asked to recite the days of the week, he'd always skip it, every time. And when corrected, he'd frown and say, "That's not a real word." One night, during a sleep study, Carl whispered something in a language that didn't register as any known dialect. The audio was analyzed by a linguistics professor who said it resembled a phonetic system based on pressure, not sound. Like the structure of the language was built around the idea of weight, or gravitational direction. Carl never spoke of what he saw, but one night, while standing in the backyard, staring up at the stars, he turned to his daughter and said, "They don't fly like we think they do. They fall, sideways, until the air forgets how to push." The next morning, he was gone. No note, no signs of struggle. Just a single, folded blueprint left on the kitchen table drawn by hand, in his familiar precise strokes. It showed a craft, smooth, lens-like, with a center cavity shaped exactly like a human spine. At the bottom, written in the same steady handwriting, were the words, "There are no straight lines in their sky," and just beneath that, a smudged attempt to write the word Tuesday. It ended halfway through. They called it S4, never spelled out, never explained. Just a letter and a number spoken with the kind of reverence people usually reserve for cathedrals or weapons. It wasn't a building. It was beneath the buildings, buried under the test ranges and dry lake beds of Groom Lake, beyond the runways and hangars everyone already feared. Former security personnel never described it fully, not because they wouldn't, but because they couldn't. Some claimed, the memory fades the moment you leave the perimeter. Others said, it wasn't just secrecy, it was design. Your brain wasn't allowed to hold the details. Something filtered you before you even saw the door. One man, now dying of bone cancer in northern Arizona, remembered just one thing clearly. You didn't open it with a badge. You opened it with your pulse. Retina scans were standard by the 1980s. But what he described was different. A chair, padded, metallic. You sat in it, placed your hands on 2 cold pads, and waited. The system didn't just read your eyes, it read your thoughts. Not words, not pictures, patterns. If your thinking didn't match the expected rhythm, they never told you what that meant. You weren't just denied access. You forgot you even tried. The interior was silent, sterile, no windows. The air had a thickness to it, like breathing through wool. Most people worked no deeper than level 2. Only a handful made it to level 5, and none of them stayed long. Rumors said level 6 didn't even have doors, just transitions, hallways that curved where geometry said they shouldn't, and rooms lit from nowhere. One guard said the light came from behind your eyes. When asked how high clearance went, one man smiled without humor and said, "Not high, deep." He claimed no president had ever stepped inside. not because they weren't allowed, but because it wasn't built for them. One briefing document, he swore, started with the line, "This facility predates current governmental frameworks." Another document stated plainly, "Presidential oversight, unnecessary. Autonomy essential." The most chilling testimony came from a technician who worked climate controls. He described one corridor where the temperature dropped 20 degrees without any air systems engaged. And always in that hall, no matter what time of day, the same sound, a soft clicking, like teeth tapping against glass, just outside your hearing. No photos, no blueprints, no trace on any public record. And yet, the same phrase appeared across 3 separate testimonies, given years apart by people who never met. It didn't matter who was in office. S4 ran itself. Whatever was down there, it didn't ask permission. It just waited. The footage was only 23 seconds long. Grainy, low resolution, clearly filmed from a handheld device shaking ever so slightly in the dark. No sound. Just a stark room, white walls, metal corners, and a single table made of what looked like thick glass or acrylic. But it wasn't the table that drew attention. It was what floated above it. 3 military men, all in uniform with blurred-out name patches, stood around the table. One of them held a standard regulation bowling ball, deep red, scratched, heavy. He lifted it and placed it gently onto the glass. Only, it didn't land. It hovered, maybe 3 inches off the surface, perfectly still. No wires, no vibrations. Just suspended in mid-air, as if the earth had forgotten it existed. The second officer added another ball. Same effect. No sound, no visible support. They spun slightly when touched, but they didn't fall. They simply floated there like puppets with strings that no one could see. Then, the third officer, an older man, brought out a chair. Simple, metal-framed, thin black cushioning, nothing remarkable. He placed it near the table, adjusted something underneath it, then sat. The moment he did, the footage distorted. The screen shimmered like heat waves off desert asphalt, and the man lifted, slowly, smoothly. He hovered just inches above the floor, sitting in the chair as if nothing had changed. His boots dangled, no reaction on his face, like it wasn't his first time. That was the end of the clip. No context, no voices, no source metadata. But within hours of its first upload on a fringe conspiracy forum long since shut down, it spread like fire. Every mirror vanished. Accounts were deleted. The original uploader's profile was replaced with a generic, "This user no longer exists" notice. A few digital archivists managed to keep copies offline. One tried to repost the footage 3 days later. His internet was cut mid-upload, not throttled, disconnected. His modem reportedly melted, not overheated, melted. Experts who saw the footage in time swore it was real, not computer-generated. Not augmented, the shadows were consistent, the reflections accurate. One physicist said the distortions around the chair resembled field lensing, the kind produced by extremely powerful gravitational shifts. But no conventional tech could do that in a room with no visible generators. The footage was eventually classified, quietly, retroactively. The chair, according to one redacted document, was part of a short-lived test called Project Seesaw and was based on a recovered artifact that had no moving parts, no power source, and no wiring. Just a shape, a material, a presence. One line from the document still circulates in dark corners of the net. "We did not build the chair. We do not understand the chair. We only know it obeys something other than mass. And whatever that something is, it does not belong here. Red Mercury was the bait, the myth, a radioactive unicorn that spies whispered about in smoky backrooms and arms dealers chased across continents. Described as crimson, dense, and somehow explosive without needing fission, Red Mercury became the perfect ghost. Intelligence reports in the 1980s and 90s claimed it could trigger suitcase nukes. Others said it could amplify conventional warheads tenfold. No one ever proved it existed. But everyone talked about it. And that was the point. Because while the world obsessed over red mercury, something else was being quietly tested deep in the Nevada desert under a program called Silent Finch. It didn't appear in Pentagon budgets. It didn't involve uranium or plutonium. It wasn't a bomb at all. It was a chamber, 12 feet across, perfectly spherical, with no doors, constructed from layered alloys that defied magnetic measurement. The Silent Finch prototype was never announced, never named publicly, and never stored above ground. Only a handful of engineers were cleared to work on it. One of them later described the chamber as indifferent to gravity. When unpowered, it weighed just over 1,000 pounds. But once activated without any power cables attached, it would become lighter, then heavier, then something else. It would shimmer faintly, like the air around it was being confused. They never called it an engine, they called it a cavity, as if it wasn't meant to create motion, but to absorb it. According to one declassified page accidentally released for 3 hours in a FOIA request, before being retracted, the Silent Finch chamber was tested once in January of 1989. A drone was attached, not flown, simply connected by 4 rods. The moment the chamber was activated, the drone lifted 6 feet into the air and hung there. No rotors, no jets, just stillness. Then the drone moved forward. No sound, no heat. The only indication of motion was the dust curling beneath it. The test lasted 12 seconds. The chamber then imploded not with violence, but with silence, folding into itself without fire, without smoke. The drone dropped like a rock. The only thing left behind was a ring of scorched soil and a pressure wave that knocked out radar for miles. A week later, a news story broke out of Prague, claiming a vial of red mercury had been intercepted by customs agents. Photos showed a thick red gel in a glass tube. The article ran on every major outlet. Silent Finch vanished from every file system that might have contained it. Red mercury was a lie, a decoy, a shadow play. But Silent Finch? That was real. And according to the last known memo before the program's termination, it was based on recovered material that responded not to electricity or magnetism, but to intention. That memo ended with just 3 words. It wants motion. The pilot's voice never wavered, but there was something in the way he spoke that felt like breathing through ice. In November of 1986, Japanese Airlines Flight 1628, a cargo flight en route from Paris to Tokyo, diverted over Alaska due to strong headwinds. As they crossed into American airspace, somewhere near Fort Yukon, the crew noticed lights too many for any known craft. At first, they assumed it was a military escort. Then the lights moved, not in a straight line, not like an aircraft. They spun around the plane, fast, controlled. And then, just beyond the cockpit window, a shape began to emerge from the dark. Not a plane, not a drone, something wider than the horizon. Something that blocked stars as it passed, then let them reappear seconds later, like a curtain being pulled open and closed. The pilot radioed Anchorage Center immediately. His transmission was calm, clipped. He described the object as the size of an aircraft carrier and said it was moving without inertia. No one in the control tower laughed. No one questioned it. They simply told him to adjust course, turn away. Don't engage. The pilot complied, but the object followed. For nearly 9 minutes, the cargo plane was shadowed by something that didn't appear on transponder, didn't emit engine noise, and moved in a way that made the air feel less like atmosphere and more like fabric being manipulated. Then, without warning, the object vanished, shot upward at an impossible angle, leaving behind only radio interference and a confused sky. The story should have ended there. And officially, it did. But someone in Anchorage saved the radar data, quietly, against orders. A technician named Gordon, last name never confirmed, kept a reel-to-reel copy of the tracking feed. It showed what should have been impossible. A blip, then 3, then 1 again. All moving faster than Mach 10 without generating a sonic boom. All circling the Japanese plane in perfectly symmetrical patterns. That reel made it out. Not to the press, not to the public, but to a small team of analysts at the Defense Intelligence Agency. One of them, now retired and living under a different name, called the pattern not random, not hostile, curious. He said, "The object didn't scan the aircraft, it scanned the crew, as if it were mapping not metal but minds." Within weeks, Flight 1628's captain was grounded, his co-pilot reassigned, the radar technician disappeared. The final FAA report was 1 paragraph long. It blamed weather, moonlight, and pilot fatigue. But inside a restricted folder at Wright-Patterson, marked with a black triangle and no other designation, the incident file contains a different conclusion, handwritten, unofficial, but chilling in its simplicity. Not first contact, not last. Observing response under stress. Whatever followed that plane wasn't trying to hide, it was watching us learn to fear. The fragments arrived in 2 lead-lined crates marked for disposal. No return address. No transit log, just a white envelope taped to the lid that read, "Deliver to room 19, no delay." Inside, the crates were pieces of metal, if it was metal at all. Charcoal black, slightly flexible, with an oily shimmer under UV light. No markings, no welds, no residue of combustion, just grooves. Thin, spiraled grooves carved across the surface, like the whorls of a fingerprint stretched across a satellite dish. The grooves weren't decorative, they weren't structural either. They formed patterns subtle, recursive, deliberate. At first glance, they looked random. But when linguists were brought in from a university lab working under a Defense Advanced Research Projects contract, the truth began to whisper through the silence. These weren't symbols. They were sounds, not letters, not words. The grooves, when scanned and translated into waveform data, emitted frequencies far beyond human hearing, ultrasonic, pulsing, rhythmic, as if the material itself was meant to sing when activated by the right vibration. The structure of the patterns aligned closely with phonemes not in English or Russian or Mandarin, but in a universal way. Pressure, duration, pitch, the building blocks of spoken thought, abstracted into a tactile surface. One analyst called it Braille for sonar. A female researcher spent weeks feeding the grooves through a spectrum mapping algorithm. Eventually, she produced a short sequence, a repeating tone, almost musical, but unsettling in its precision. When played on a custom-built speaker, the tone caused nearby electronics to desynchronize. Watches ran fast. Laptop cursors drifted. Hard drives clicked like distant insects. And in the center of the lab, a glass of water began to tremble not from bass, but from something deeper. Subsonic rearrangement. The tone wasn't just sound, it was instruction. The hull wasn't painted with a message, it was the message. Those who touched the fragments reported odd dreams, low corridors, cold winds, a voice that spoke in a language without vowels. One researcher described waking up with blood on his pillow and a single word scratched into his notebook: breathe. He did not remember writing it. The team was disbanded within weeks. The fragments were moved to a classified site in the Nevada desert. The lead researcher, now under oath, later told a Senate subcommittee in closed session that what they found wasn't just language. It was architecture, not metaphorical but functional. A communication system embedded into the material of a vessel, like ribs in a body, designed not just to say something, but to be something. One redacted report ended with this observation: "This is not language meant for learning. It is language meant for triggering. And the grooves? They're still humming, even in storage, even in silence, waiting for someone to say the right word without ever using their voice. The first one was just a disc. A simple, brushed steel shell, with no cockpit, no seams, no visible propulsion. It hovered, lifted, and pivoted with grace that made helicopters look like bricks. But when the operators tried to bank it to the right, nothing happened. It stalled, buzzed, and gently rotated left instead, as if refusing the command not out of failure but defiance. At first, engineers blamed calibration, then software, then structural imbalance. But each successive prototype, 7 in total, built between 1974 and 1981, carried the same curse. Perfect motion in every direction except one, no right turns. Not in the air, not even on a grounded hover pad. Every attempt pulled the craft into a spiral, or worse, an abrupt vertical lift, as if trying to flee the command entirely. Internal documents from Lockheed's Black Division called it directional resistance, but those closer to the source the physicists brought in under temporary contracts with no return addresses had another name for it: dimensional drag. To understand it, they said, you had to abandon everything about terrestrial propulsion. This wasn't about thrust or gyroscopes. The craft didn't push against air. It folded through space, not like warping, not like bending, but slicing, a controlled tear through what they called locational certainty fields, essentially reality anchors, and every test showed the same outcome. Left turns flowed with almost no resistance, but right turns fought back. Not because of the machine, but because of something deeper. The engineers described it as trying to write against the grain of the universe. One even suggested that rightward motion engaged a part of space that pushed back. Not physically, but conceptually. A classified experiment conducted in 1983 involved attaching a pilot's neural feedback directly to the control core. Instead of a joystick, he thought the commands. He tried to turn right. His body seized, not violently, quietly. His vitals spiked, his pupils dilated. He said he could see the direction but not reach it. Like there was a hallway in his mind that suddenly turned to fog. He was grounded permanently. The project, unofficially dubbed Chiral Echo, was suspended weeks later. Some think the recovered tech wasn't broken. It was simply never designed for us. It followed rules written in a system we didn't evolve to understand. A system where right isn't just a direction, it's a dimension. And moving through it requires something we don't possess. One surviving schematic contains a strange diagram. It shows a craft mid-turn, arrows looping left, and next to it, a handwritten note. Left is memory, right is something else, something that remembers us. So every test since has been adjusted, every command recalibrated, every flight plan carefully looped in one direction only, because now we know, the moment we try to turn right, it might turn back. Long before the name Bob Lazar became an echo in every UFO documentary and desert diner booth, there was someone else. His real name never made the papers. The few who knew him just called him Dr. A physicist, maybe. Or maybe something closer to a linguist of motion, if such a thing exists. He worked at S4 in the late 1970s, years before Lazar ever set foot near Groom Lake. And then, without ceremony or scandal, he disappeared. Not vanished, relocated. A quiet relocation. Witness protection, but not the usual kind. Not after testifying, not after betrayal, but preemptively before he could become a problem. His last recorded words during a debrief weren't about extraterrestrials or reverse engineering. They were about lensing. He said propulsion was a misnomer. That what we found in the desert didn't fly because it had fuel. It flew because it bent what it meant to be somewhere. He drew it on a napkin, a cup of water, a magnifying glass, and a straight beam of light passing through both. One bends, one doesn't. The key wasn't the energy source, he said. The key was the medium. The craft didn't move through space, it warped space around itself, like a marble sinking into fabric. Or more accurately, like a gravity lens made out of something that shouldn't exist in this part of the universe. That's what Dr. A said the engine was. Not a combustion chamber, not an ion drive, but a shaped mass, a lattice that created localized distortions in gravitational curvature. He didn't call it an engine, he called it an anchor, because once activated, it didn't push, it fell. Directionally, toward locations that didn't yet exist. No one understood him, not at first. But one night, he left his ID badge on a console, walked out, took nothing. A week later, the base psychologist filed a note stating Dr. A had become obsessed with the idea that the craft's system wasn't just mechanical, but interactive, that it responded to questions we didn't know we were asking. Within 2 months, every mention of his name was stripped from the logs. The few who asked were told he was reassigned. Others were told he never existed. But 10 years later, during the flurry of media attention surrounding Lazar's claims, a single memo surfaced on a secure server. It was unsigned, unclassified, probably leaked, just 3 sentences. Lazar is the distraction, a deliberate one, a buys time while A forgets. The implication was chilling. Bob Lazar might have seen a sliver of the truth, but someone else lived in the center of it and was buried before he could finish the sentence. And if Dr. A was right, the craft never needed pilots. It needed witnesses. It started as nosebleeds. Then came the vertigo, short lapses. One man forgot the name of his wife. Another walked out of a grocery store and couldn't remember how to start his car. All of them had one thing in common. They had worked in Hangar 9 at the Nevada test range. And none of them remembered what they did there, only that it involved a black box, a lab coat, and silence. In 1991, a neurologist in Colorado Springs began seeing a pattern in his patients. Former military engineers suffering cognitive degradation without trauma or age. Brain scans showed something strange. Clusters of shimmering particles embedded deep in the temporal lobe, specifically the hippocampus and adjacent memory pathways. The neurologist assumed it was debris, environmental contamination, maybe metal shavings inhaled during aircraft assembly. But one particle was retrieved during an autopsy, microscopic, hexagonal. Not surgical metal, not industrial, a kind of alloy not cataloged in any medical material database, and it was vibrating, not visibly, not even at frequencies audible to animals, but at a subatomic level. The lattice structure was in constant flux, almost like it was recording. The fragment was sent to a private lab in Santa Fe. After a week of analysis, the lab shut down. Not metaphorically, physically. Doors locked, staff relocated, building repurposed for a geological survey office. The sample never came back, but the engineer who submitted it had already taken notes. In a handwritten journal later leaked to a civilian investigator, he described the particles as hitchhikers, not placed, but grown inside the brain, as if whatever technology these men worked near had seeded them with memory dust, ultra-thin, self-assembling sensors designed not to damage, but to copy. One of the affected personnel, in a lucid moment, said he could sometimes hear voices in his dreams not speaking, but replaying, like old meetings, like childhood sounds. Except they were never his memories. He remembered someone else's first steps. The theory that emerged was horrifying. The dust wasn't causing memory loss. It was replacing memory bit by bit. Each lesion wasn't decay. It was overwrite. And each particle was a receiver. But for who? In 2004, the Department of Energy classified a short paper titled Temporal Lobe Anomalies in High-Security Engineering Personnel. It ended with one chilling footnote. Cognitive artifact appears consistent with telemetry. Unknown, if passive or bidirectional. Bidirectional, which meant it could be listening or responding. So when the engineers started forgetting names, dates, faces. It may not have been illness. It may have been redaction, not from the outside, not even by choice, but by design. Because once you saw what they were building, you became part of it, and it remembered. Even if you didn't, they were smaller than a shoebox. Matte, black, silent, always just out of reach. Security personnel working graveyard shifts at Papoose Lake started seeing them after night drills, darting between vehicles, hovering over trailers, vanishing the moment flashlights hit them. One man said he thought it was a bird, until it stopped in midair and rotated without wings, without rotors, without any motion at all. The drones never followed in daylight, only after long shifts. Only when a guard had been too close to something. One guard, Raymond S., was the first to try filming them, used a personal camcorder. Nothing showed up, just static where the thing had hovered. Not even a silhouette, just blankness, like the air had been edited. He tried again with a thermal scope. Same result. The pixels went dark. Not cold, not hot. Absent. Then came the voice. Raymond described walking to his truck one night when he heard it. A woman's voice, soft and deliberate, not speaking but counting, backwards. In a language that was English, but not. Familiar phonemes, twisted, like a dream half remembered. He said it felt like the voice wasn't beside him, but inside the vehicle, curled in the wires. He turned the key. The voice paused, then began again, 56, 55, 54, and then it stopped. The engine wouldn't start. Another guard female, name withheld, reported hearing music through her radio. Classical, but wrong. Notes looping, but off by half a beat. Every time she changed the station, it returned, overlaid, not broadcast but injected. The pattern was always the same: drone sighting, followed by an audio event. Sometimes voices. Sometimes mechanical hums that matched no known frequency band. One technician ran a spectrogram of the sound. It showed gaps, voids at regular intervals, like a zipper missing every other tooth. He called them data valleys. The implication was simple. These weren't surveillance drones. They were writing something, or rather, rewriting. Not recording the outside, but interacting with perception. Whispering into the space between thought and awareness. A form of low-level interrogation. The kind that doesn't leave marks, only doubt. Raymond eventually quit. Moved to New Mexico. Wouldn't speak to anyone. But he mailed one final envelope to a journalist who had once tried to interview him. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no letter, just a transcribed set of numbers, all primes, all descending, and at the very bottom, one sentence. When the last number is said, you forget the question. The drones haven't been seen since, or maybe they have, and you just don't remember. Hangar 6 was never on any map. Not on paper, not digital, not even on the base's internal schematics. You had to know someone. You had to be invited. And even then, the only entrance was through a tunnel carved into the rock behind a false maintenance depot near Tonopah. The tunnel descended for what felt like miles, a soft hum increasing the deeper you went. Not a sound exactly, but a feeling. Like your bones were picking up on something your ears couldn't hear. Inside Hangar 6, everything was circular. No corners, no right angles. The walls weren't painted, they were grown. Some said the structure was poured from a composite polymer. Others whispered that it was a single solid mold, one that had never cooled. But all agreed on one thing. When the door sealed, the noise began. The room didn't echo. Sound went somewhere else. Taps, clinks, footsteps muted like underwater. But then the hum would rise, deep and slow, like a mountain clearing its throat. The walls shimmered slightly, not visibly, but in your teeth. One technician said his fillings hurt. Another vomited blood. And then there was the singing. The man, only known as David T., was a civilian contractor assigned to clean acoustic sensors after a test run. He wasn't supposed to enter the core chamber, but the readings had spiked and he was ordered inside. What he described afterward couldn't be explained by any conventional physics. He said the air felt thick, like it had edges, that his skin prickled not from cold, but from rhythm, like he was standing inside a tuning fork. When he spoke, his own voice vibrated back at him, not in his ears, but in the base of his spine. Then came the sensation in his jaw, a low tone, vibrating the mandible like a crystal being bowed. He could feel it singing, not metaphorically, literally, a tone, steady and high, vibrating only his jawbone while the rest of his body remained still. He stumbled out, collapsed. He couldn't speak for 12 hours. Later, doctors found microfractures in his zygomatic arch and lower mandible consistent with sustained resonance, like the kind used in destructive sound testing of ceramics. But here's the part they buried. The waveform captured during that event was not random. It matched a tone recorded by a deep-sea probe in the Mariana Trench in 1977. The same frequency, the same rise and fall. Except this one was inland. The conclusion was chilling. Whatever Hangar 6 was built around it wasn't silent. It was calling back, in a language that skipped the ears, bypassed the brain, and etched itself directly into the skeleton. And some say, if you stood in that room too long, it wouldn't be your bones that sang. It would be your name. He had logged over 3,000 hours in supersonic jets, flew everything from stealth interceptors to reconnaissance prototypes. But the day they walked him down the slope beneath Groom Lake and into the windowless chamber, marked only with a black triangle, he said it felt like stepping out of time. The craft didn't have wings. It didn't even have a cockpit, just a concave chamber with a narrow ledge, like a saddle made of dark glass and something else, something alive. He called it the Ark. Said it pulsed faintly when he placed his hand on it, like a heartbeat sinking to his own. They didn't give him a joystick, no throttle, just a calm voice over the intercom telling him to breathe and think forward. So he did. He thought about climbing. He visualized his hands gripping a stick, pulling back gently, as if the sky itself had mass. The lights changed. The hum shifted. His stomach dropped hard. G-forces. But the room hadn't moved. That's when everything fractured. He remembered colors. Not light, but emotion, pulsing through his spine. He described a feeling like being pulled into a thought too big for his skull. Then nothing. He woke up, strapped to a stretcher, in a hangar that wasn't the one he started in. The air smelled like salt. He could hear gulls. He was in Hawaii. 12 minutes had passed. They told him it was a simulation, that the entire event took place inside a neural feedback chamber, meant to test reflex latency. But he didn't believe them, because of the tan line. The tan line on his wrist from the watch he always wore. Except, now, the line was gone. As if his body had been somewhere else. Somewhere outside. Later, he snuck a glance at a debriefing screen. The folder labeled Pilot Arc Echo 17. Under remarks, a single sentence was highlighted. Subject exhibits nonverbal drive compatibility. Suggest memory curtain protocol. He was discharged 6 weeks later. Medical leave. No details. They paid him through a defense contractor in Maryland. But he kept the arc burned into his mind. Not what it looked like, what it felt like. The direction didn't come from a lever or dial. It came from intention. The craft didn't respond to controls. It responded to resolve. And when he asked them what powered it, a quiet man in a lab coat only said this: it doesn't move through space. It removes space from the equation. They never let him near it again. But sometimes, when he closes his eyes, he says he can still feel the arc waiting like it remembered him, or worse, like it was still inside him. They found the compartment sealed behind a panel of smooth, iridescent alloy. No hinges, no screws, no keyhole. It responded only when the pressure dropped. One technician joked it was like the craft itself was holding its breath. Inside, Cushioned in a lattice of transparent mesh lay a scroll no wider than a dollar bill, coiled like a sleeping insect. The material was soft, almost cloth-like, but shimmered under light like wet graphite. When they opened it, the page was blank. No symbols, no ink, just an empty surface, warm to the touch. They assumed it was a storage medium, maybe magnetic, maybe thermal. But then someone opened it again, this time in a vacuum chamber. Lines began to appear, not written in ink, not etched, but grown from within. Flowing like veins under skin, the symbols danced into view, curved, looping, musical, not alien in the way people imagine, all harsh lines and insect geometry. This was elegant. Designed not to intimidate, but to whisper. They tried to scan it. Cameras failed. The patterns dissolved the moment the document was exposed to oxygen. It wasn't just fading, it was escaping. They tried nitrogen, argon. Nothing worked. Then someone tried helium, and the symbols not only returned, but began to move. Slight shifts. Shimmering ripples, like a frequency embedded in the script itself, was sinking to vibration. A linguist watching the live feed fainted. When she woke up, she said one thing. It wasn't writing, it was listening. The scroll was placed in a sealed container and transported to a facility beneath Mount Charleston. Over the next 9 days, 5 different specialists attempted to decode it. None succeeded, but each began to exhibit the same behavior, scribbling symbols in their sleep. Symbols that matched the scroll, but weren't direct copies. Variants. Like musical improvisations on a theme they didn't consciously know. The conclusion was chilling. It wasn't a message, it was a seed, a self-interpreting artifact, not meant to be read, but to teach how to read. Not immediately, not quickly, but subtly, over time. It didn't need translation. It needed proximity, because whatever wrote those documents didn't assume we'd understand. It assumed we'd change. By the 12th day, the scroll had begun to dim. The movement slowed. The symbols froze. One technician, whose name remains redacted, slipped a note into the container just before it was resealed. He wrote, "We breathed on it too soon. The container remains buried in a black site vault, pressurized with helium, unreadable now. Silent. But somewhere, the linguist still dreams in curves, and sometimes, when she exhales, her breath fogs in patterns. They said it was just a respiratory infection. A bad one. Sure, but nothing unexpected for someone who had worked in pressure-sealed chambers for years. He had been coughing for weeks, but the sound wasn't wet or raspy. It was dry, hollow, like a bag of ash being shaken. He joked about it at first, called it his alien flu. Then he stopped joking. When he collapsed in his garage, still in his blue lab jacket, the paramedics were told not to bring him to the nearest hospital. A nondescript black van arrived first. No sirens, no questions. The autopsy didn't go through normal channels. It was done inside a gray facility below Nellis by a team that wore full containment suits. They weren't worried about contamination. They were worried about activation. Inside the lungs, they found something impossible. Not tissue damage, not fluid, but fibers. Hundreds of them, laced throughout the bronchial branches like spun glass. Under an electron microscope, the fibers showed a structure no synthetic could replicate. Carbon-laced silica, wound into spirals that shifted based on temperature. They didn't burn. They didn't melt. They vibrated. A test probe applied a standard EM field. The fibers resonated in response, not randomly, but rhythmically, like a tuning fork responding to a memory. They cross-referenced the fiber structure with known materials. Only one match came up. It was in the wall samples taken from Vault Delta, a classified site buried beneath the desert. The vault had no door, only a hatch that opened when touched in complete silence. The walls inside were lined with the same fibers, millions of them, woven into the concrete like veins through a body. The technician hadn't been inside that vault, not directly. But he had handled a fragment recovered from within, just once, gloveless, for less than a minute. The assumption had always been that the material was inert, that it was structural, insulating, passive. But now there was a new theory. It wasn't passive. It was alive. Not in a biological sense, but in a reactive one. The fibers didn't resist damage, they absorbed memory. They remembered touch, vibration, breath, and when they entered the lungs of a living host, they began replaying what they knew over and over. The technician didn't die from exposure. He drowned in stored experience. One note in the autopsy read, "The lungs weren't diseased. They were echo chambers. The body was cremated before the family could see it. But the ashes left a residue in the urn, fine, black, and faintly magnetic. They buried it in the yard, and 2 nights later, the family dog stood by the spot and refused to move, just stared, trembling, at nothing. Then started to cough. They weren't supposed to be watching, not from that ridge, not with cameras. But the 3 of them, an amateur astronomer, his teenage niece, and a local who used to work security near Groom Lake, had been tracking the silent flights for weeks. Not military jets, not drones. These were different. They made no sound, left no trail, and didn't blink. That night, the girl had a handheld camcorder, late 1990s, tape-based, low resolution. She aimed it at the stars while her uncle adjusted a telescope toward the horizon, where the mountains gave way to darkness. They were waiting for the usual distant flickers or sudden bursts of impossible speed. But instead, the sky shifted. It didn't move. It bent. As something passed below the stars, the constellations above didn't remain still. They warped as if seen through water. For just a few seconds, the stars stretched sideways, like a curtain being pulled too tight, then snapped back to perfect position. She caught it on tape. The others didn't believe her at first, thought it was a lens issue, a reflection. But when they played it back, they didn't see glare. They saw distortion, controlled, intentional, like the space above the craft wasn't space anymore but something less stiff. Then the tape screeched. Not the usual static. A grinding sound. Metallic. Sharp. The camcorder jammed. Smoke curling out of its vents. The tape head melted. They sent the cartridge to a friend in Vegas who worked AV repair for the local news. He tried to salvage it using a cleaning system designed for fire-damaged reels. That's when his equipment failed. All of it. The drive seized. The lights flickered. One of the CRT monitors caught fire. Not sparked, ignited. The repairman called once more, hours later, voice shaking. He said, "It's not just a recording. It's still doing something. Like the film remembers what it saw." He mailed the tape back the next morning, but when it arrived, it had been opened. The box was resealed with a label marked, "Returned undeliverable." Inside was not the same cartridge. This one was blank, fresh, never used. The girl swore it wasn't theirs. Said she had scratched a tiny star on the bottom with a paperclip. It was gone. But sometimes, when they watched the night sky after that, the stars would pulse faintly just once when nothing visible passed by, as if they knew someone was watching again. And somewhere, a melted tape head still hums faintly, bent, twisted, singing a sound only machines remember, the sound of space forgetting how to stay still. They drilled for a new storage vault, expecting nothing but layers of limestone and dead rock. The site was west of Mercury, Nevada, quiet, remote, sterilized by decades of weapons testing. When the drill hit something hollow at 300 feet, the crew assumed it was an old bomb shaft, maybe abandoned in the 1950s. But what they found was not steel. It was smooth, no seams, no welds, no corrosion. A single, curved wall of a dull gray alloy that resisted all cutters and torches. Even the laser probes bounced. The opening was accidental. A pressure shift cracked part of the rock and revealed a chamber not carved, not built but placed, perfectly spherical. Exactly 40 feet wide, with an inner lining that shimmered faintly under light but did not reflect. Sound inside dropped to near zero. Not muffled, cancelled. They lowered a radiation meter. It went silent, then lit up with patterns no one could explain. Not spikes, not surges, rhythms. The patterns didn't match known radioactive decay, so they sent in core samplers and recovered 3 thin shavings of the chamber wall. The samples were couriered to a university lab under a standard contract for isotopic dating. That's when the phones went dead. The lab called back 48 hours later, but not through normal lines. A secure line, rerouted through an Air Force relay. They didn't say hello. They said one word: unlisted. The shavings didn't contain carbon, didn't contain uranium. They held isotopes that were not just unknown, they were forbidden by physics, half-lives that implied decay cycles lasting millions of years, or none at all. One particle was theorized to exist only in supernova remnants. Another had properties that inverted under heat. These elements did not belong anywhere in the solar system, which raised the obvious question: who put them there? A theory emerged, one that no one wanted to write down. The chamber had been below Mercury before Mercury existed, before the desert, before the bombs, before us. A fossil, maybe, or a capsule. One scientist called it a womb of memory, a phrase that was never used again. Attempts to extract the chamber failed. One drill bit snapped, another melted, a third simply vanished, along with 3 feet of cable. They sealed the site within 72 hours. The official record shows it as a failed borehole. The surrounding soil is marked as unstable. No further excavation was allowed. But the chamber remains, still humming, still perfectly round, and the isotopes inside it don't tick like a clock. They pulse like a heart. It started as whispers in the break room. Engineers half joking, half nervous, comparing how little they'd slept, how vivid things felt lately. Not stress dreams, not nightmares. These were structured, rehearsed, as if they weren't just dreaming about something they were being taught. One said it first, quietly. "Did yours have the tall ones too?" No one laughed. Every one of them described the same impossible detail: a room with no walls, lit by a soft glow that had no source. The figures, tall, but not monstrous, stood in silence, watching. Sometimes they would raise a hand, not to speak, but to tune the space, like they were adjusting a string in the air, and when they did, the metal would bend, not melt, not crack. It would shift, like clay remembering a previous shape. One engineer, James F., kept a dream journal. He'd started during a classified project at a facility buried deep beneath Tonopah. They were trying to replicate what they only called the artifact, a curved panel with no welds, no joints, and a density that shifted depending on how you touched it. Their goal wasn't to recreate it, just to understand how it held together. James had the dream on a Thursday. He remembered the figures more clearly than ever. They made no sound, but somehow he knew what they were telling him. To strike the panel's edge not with force, but frequency. A tone, a hum, a single pitch tuned perfectly to the shape's inner curve. He woke up, drenched in sweat, ran to his desk, and began sketching. Not freehand, not guessing, blueprinting. He had no memory of learning the symbols, but his page filled with arcs, wave diagrams, vibration nodes. By the time the sun rose, he had diagrammed a schematic that used resonant frequency welding, a process not yet developed, at least not publicly. He didn't report it, not directly. Instead, he shared it during a technical meeting as a thought experiment. By the following week, the design had been flagged, extracted, and removed from his access log. 2 months later, The same concept appeared in a patent filed by a subsidiary of a well-known defense contractor. The inventor's name was blank, filed through a shell firm. The method using sound to fuse exotic alloys without heat was approved, classified, and buried. James knew he'd never own it, but that wasn't what haunted him. It was the next dream, the same room, the same light. But this time, the tall figures stood closer. One reached out not toward the metal but toward him, touched his forehead with 2 fingers. He didn't wake up screaming. He didn't wake up at all. His wife found him at 6:30 the next morning, still sitting at his desk, eyes wide open, pulse faint. He came back after 11 minutes, but he never worked again. He said, "I don't need to. They gave me the rest." For weeks afterward, he'd hum to himself without realizing it, always the same frequency. When asked what it was, he'd just say, "A key." To what? He never answered. But one night, the humming stopped, and outside his house, 3 neighbors reported hearing a low tone in the sky, like something enormous was listening for the next instruction. They found the drawings under her bed, folded into the pages of a Lisa Frank notebook. Crayon lines at first glance, bright colors, swirling shapes, a child's imagination gone wild. But look closer, and you could see it. Symmetry, ratios, alignment far too precise for a 9-year-old who had never been taught geometry. She was the daughter of a base commander stationed near Groom Lake in the late 1990s. Her name was Emily, small for her age, quiet in class, often staring out the window during lessons. Teachers thought she was just daydreaming. Her mother said she barely spoke at dinner. Her father, Colonel Richard M., said nothing at all. But one night, during a base-wide lockdown, Emily began to draw. Not scribbles, schematics. Cross-sections of an object she had never seen. Angles that bent inward. Arcs that connected in impossible layers. In the top corner of one page, she had written a single word in block letters, lens. Her mother didn't understand what it meant. Her father went pale when he saw it. He locked the drawings in a file cabinet. The next morning, he requested an immediate transfer. It was denied. 6 days later, the family drove toward Las Vegas to attend a school orientation. On the stretch of highway between Indian Springs and Creech, their sedan spun out on a dry road. No other vehicles, no tire marks, no warning. Emily was killed on impact. The car was taken for investigation, but the file vanished from the Nevada Highway Patrol records. Local police had no jurisdiction. The coroner's report listed blunt trauma, but the deputy later told a friend that Emily's internal injuries didn't match the force. Her drawings were gone within 48 hours. Colonel Richard M. resigned from service within the month and moved out of state. He never spoke to media, never wrote a memoir, never appeared on any veteran registry. Years later, a contractor reviewing archival scans from an old classified facility noticed a blueprint embedded in the footer of a patent barely visible, like a watermark. The curves matched Emily's crayon lines. That contractor submitted a FOIA request for project records. It was denied. The rejection notice included a sentence rarely seen: information not subject to public inquiry under Clause 13-7. Preconscious acquisition. The term didn't exist anywhere else, but it suggests something chilling. Emily wasn't shown the object. She remembered it. And now there's no trace of her life except a missing report, a sealed road, and a humming sound recorded on a baby monitor 2 houses down the night before she died. The memo was never meant to surface. It was labeled routine interagency correspondence buried inside a folder of budget amendments and contractor evaluations. But one line caught the whistleblower's eye. Dated August of the year 2003, it read, "Ensure patents aligned with off-world IP repository prior to terrestrial registration. Avoid duplications." At first glance, it looked like a clerical error. Off-world? A typo maybe? Internal slang? But the rest of the paragraph made the mistake impossible. It listed project codes, not company names, entities not traceable to any Earth-based manufacturer. The funding trail wasn't routed through defense contractors. It came from offshore accounts tied to foundations that technically didn't exist until 2 years after the memo was written. The leaker, a DARPA analyst nearing retirement, they had seen odd things before: research into acoustic levitation, experiments in programmable matter, even failed propulsion tests using electromagnetic vacuums. But this was different. This wasn't speculation. This was bureaucracy, a system. He began digging through old patent filings, not the public ones. The sealed applications archived under exception codes reserved for national security and commercial preemption. These were patents filed, but never released, never approved, never challenged. All of them shared the same anomaly: a series of cross-reference IDs that didn't point to Earth-based equivalents. Instead, they linked to something called OWP-11. When he asked a superior what it stood for, he was told, outdated work proposal. But later that night, while scanning restricted indexes, he found a classified glossary. OWP, off-world patent. The repository wasn't on any digital map. Its location was marked 12 Echo, a designation used in only one other place. Encrypted black site documentation related to material recovered from non-terrestrial incidents. It meant someone somewhere was filing patents, not to invent new technology, but to mirror what had already been recovered, to claim Earth-based ownership over something reverse-engineered from another origin. The leaker sent his findings to 3 journalists. None responded. One went missing 2 weeks later. Another posted a tweet at 3:47 in the morning, then deleted it 10 minutes later. It said, "We don't invent, we translate." And the third journalist? He died in a motel fire in Sparks, Nevada. Electrical fault, they said. But in the wreckage, firefighters found a flash drive fused to the inside of the mattress frame. It contained the original memo, and a list of 47 patent numbers, each marked with a triangle, inverted. Every one of those patents is now owned by companies you've never heard of, but you use their technology every day, and they didn't invent it. They were just given permission to pretend. The room was windowless, sterile, buried beneath layers of concrete and protocol. They called it Chamber 6, though it had no number on the door, just a symbol, 3 overlapping circles carved into steel. Inside, resting on a pedestal that hummed with a low-frequency tone, was the object, a sphere suspended within a pyramidal lattice, spinning slowly, silently, against gravity. It had been found during a core excavation beneath the Nevada test site in the early 1970s. The pyramid, metallic but warm to the touch, was unmarked. But the sphere inside, the way it moved, it wasn't mechanical. It rotated through itself, folding and unfolding in ways that made cameras glitch and men dizzy. They stored it, cataloged it, then forgot about it for over a decade. Until someone noticed something strange. An intern, no older than 19, brought his dog to the facility one day. A mutt. Limp in the back leg, cloudy eyes, snout gone white. Against all protocol, he left the dog in Chamber 6, while maintenance was being done on nearby air filters, only for a few hours. When he returned, the dog was barking, running, eyes clear, teeth sharp, the limp gone. The dog looked 7 years younger. Security reviewed the tapes. What they saw didn't make sense. The sphere had increased in speed, subtle but measurable. And the timestamp of the footage? It began to drift backward, second by second, until it looped, then stabilized. Every material test after that showed molecular rejuvenation. The plastic floor tiles had fewer microfractures. The copper in the wiring showed less oxidation. One researcher's fillings were gone, replaced by virgin enamel. The department classified the sphere as temporal anomaly beta, but internally, They called it the fountain. Attempts to move it failed. Every time they tried to lift the pyramid, the temperature in the room dropped to sub-zero. Not air temperature, body temperature. One man's blood nearly crystallized before they stopped. No one knew how it worked, but a German engineer, former aerospace, said it resembled something described in a manuscript recovered after the war. A design found etched into a bronze plate buried beneath a stone monolith near Lake Baikal. That plate is now missing. When DARPA ran a final test, they left a bouquet of flowers in the chamber for exactly 36 hours. A week later, the petals were still dewy, the stems still green. But the water in the vase had evaporated completely. They shut the room, locked it, posted no guards. But last year, a janitor walked by and swore he heard something. Not spinning, not humming, laughing. They ran the test on a clear winter night in 1991, just outside the Tonopah facility, under a waxing moon. The craft fragment no bigger than a coffee table was placed on an isolation slab. No electricity, no wiring, just moonlight. And yet, it moved, not physically, but perceptually. It shimmered like heat on pavement, then stilled, then shimmered again. What the scientists saw next wasn't a malfunction. It was camouflage, that thought. A technician described it first. The metal didn't just reflect moonlight. It refracted it, bending it, weaving it, as if rewriting the environment. The desert around the slab began to ripple. Cactus vanished, shadows reversed direction. One man swore he saw a brick wall where none existed. Another stepped forward and nearly fell because the ground had looked like it extended, but the slab had cut off into nothing. It created illusions not based on light, but on expectation. The lead analyst called it psychogenic refraction. But the internal designation became something darker, psychogenic stealth. Not just hiding a machine from view, but convincing the mind it was never there to begin with. A week later, they ran the same test inside, under controlled light, no moon, just simulated lunar spectrum bulbs, and the illusions changed again. This time, the room appeared upside down. The ceiling became the floor. One observer vomited blood. A second suffered a microstroke. It only affected those who looked directly at the material, not through a camera, not through a reflection. Eyeball contact was the key. That's when someone made the connection. They weren't just testing light. They were testing consciousness under observation. The material responded differently depending on who looked at it. A soldier from Louisiana saw his childhood home reflected. A physicist from Prague saw swirling equations. An officer recently divorced fell to his knees sobbing because he saw his ex-wife walk past him into the void. None of it was real. All of it felt more than real. After 4 confirmed psychological breaks, the project was sealed under the euphemism Moonlight Nonlinear Interference Paneling. The test slab was encased in lead and dropped into sublevel 9. Years later, when scanning it for relocation, a technician ran a new test without knowing it. He entered the vault, alone, no lights, just the sphere, and the moon visible through a ventilation shaft. He screamed 3 times, then went silent. When they found him, he was curled on the floor, murmuring the same sentence over and over. It showed me what I thought I would see, then showed me what was waiting instead. He was fading when he said it, fingers twitching beneath the hospital sheet, lips dry but determined. "The switch is real," he whispered, eyes locked on the window as if waiting for something to blot out the sky. "They buried it near Rachel. I kept the key, never gave it back." He died 17 minutes later. The nurse, still shaken from his earlier confession, wrote it down. Not because she believed him, she didn't. Not yet. But 2 days later, she drove to Rachel, Nevada, half on a dare and half because the silence in her apartment had started to hum. Locals remembered the patch of desert he described. South of Groom Road, east of a dried-out arroyo that had no name on any map. Back in the 1960s, there had been a dome, concrete, vented, no markings. It wasn't on any official blueprints. Then, in 1975, it was gone, bulldozed. But people swore they'd seen trucks, always at night, always quiet. One man said he saw a cylinder loaded into the ground with something like a crane that made no sound. Now, in its place, a communications tower, harmless, standard microwave and radio relays, blinking red in the dark, nothing beneath it. Or so they said. But in 1999, during a statewide fiber optic dig, a team hit something they weren't supposed to. Solid, curved, carbon-tempered, not concrete. A 1/4-inch drill snapped off inside it, and when they tried to cut around it with a plasma torch, the flame went out. Not dimmed, extinguished. The area was sealed within an hour. The crew relocated, all logs deleted. One surviving contractor, retired now, living near Pahrump, said they had unearthed something shaped like a hinge, like a vault door, no handle. Just a circular indentation, about the size of a man's fist. The key, they believed, had never been recovered. The pilot's widow, interviewed years later, admitted that after his funeral, she'd found something in his effects, a coin, or maybe a medallion, black, smooth, not metal, not glass. When held to the ear, it buzzed not constantly, but like breathing. She took it to a metallurgist in Reno. He ran every test. It matched no earthly substance. When she returned to retrieve it, he was gone. So was the lab. So was the building. Whatever the switch controlled, he took the access with him into the ground. And yet, on certain nights, just after midnight, the comm tower near Rachel still pulses with a second frequency, one not used by any carrier. It's always the same burst, 3 tones, then silence, then 3 tones again. Some say it's just interference. Others say it's the system asking if the key has returned. He was up $400 at the blackjack table when the envelope appeared. No one saw who left it. No pit boss remembered anyone leaning over. Just a cocktail napkin, folded in half, with his name scrawled in pencil. Underneath it, the envelope. Plain manila. Unmarked, taped shut with a single strip of clear plastic. The journalist's name was Connor Wells. He had been chasing stories about missing pilots, radar blackouts, and briefings that ended with people forgetting what room they were in. But lately, he had run into a wall of silence. Freedom of information requests came back heavily redacted or conveniently delayed. Sources clammed up. One disappeared completely. Connor was considering moving on to something safer, something smaller. Then came the envelope. He didn't open it in the casino. That would have been stupid. He tucked it under his arm, cashed out quietly, and drove back to his motel just off the strip. The room was cheap and smelled like old carpet and bleach, but the door locked, and that was enough. He opened the envelope on the desk under the flickering lamp. The first thing that fell out was a flight log. Handwritten, altitude, speed, atmospheric readings all precise. The dates ranged from 1977 to 1983. Every entry was from Groom Lake, or its outer perimeter. Several noted non-standard propulsion tests, and one was marked with a single phrase: object did not touch runway, landed vertically. No impact signature. The second item was a folded blueprint, brittle at the edges. It showed a craft, triangular in shape, but not aerodynamic in any traditional sense. It had no intake, no exhaust, no rivets or seams. The annotations were in both English and something else, curved symbols that resembled sound waves. The schematic was stamped with the initials D, T, F in the corner, but no agency name. The final item was the list, a single sheet of paper typed on an old machine, just initials and dates, 37 names. Some were familiar. Others were strangers. He recognized one immediately, A. L. the radar technician who had vanished after the triangle sighting near Creech in 1979. Another name matched a contractor who died in a supposed hiking accident near the Tonopah test range. Connor began cross-referencing the initials with obituaries. That's when the pattern emerged. Every single person on the list had died under what coroners would call undetermined circumstances. Car wrecks with no skid marks, heart attacks in people under 40, fires with no source of ignition. Several were listed as suicides, but the details never made sense. One man, B.K., had reportedly fallen from the roof of a parking garage in Dayton, Ohio, but his shoes were found inside his locked car. Another, T.S., supposedly drowned in his bathtub, though his lungs were filled not with water but a strange translucent gel. The autopsy photo had been leaked once, only once, then scrubbed. Connor scanned the room, suddenly aware of how loud his own breath sounded. He burned the envelope, but not before photographing every document. The next morning, he sent them in a secure batch to an encrypted server. Then he checked out of the motel and disappeared. 6 days later, a housekeeping employee found his room untouched, the bed unslept in, the TV on a blue screen. His phone was still plugged into the charger, his keys on the counter, no signs of struggle. What the investigators didn't find because they didn't know to look was the backup he mailed. It arrived in a metal box to a P.O. box in Kingman, Arizona. No return address, just a sticker on the inside lid with 3 words, "For the next one, no one knows who that will be. But someone will receive the box, open it, read the names, and begin seeing patterns no one else is supposed to notice." The list is still growing. It began at 0900 hours, local time. No announcement, no countdown. Just a soft whine from the test hanger, low, unsteady, and almost organic in tone. The technicians didn't notice it at first. One mistook it for interference in the headset. Another thought it was air pressure from the old vents. But by the time the humming reached its second minute, every human in the building had stopped speaking. Not because they were told to, because they couldn't. The surviving craft had not powered up in years, not since the incident near Groom Lake, where 2 handlers lost consciousness and 1 never woke up. Since then, the object about the size of a school bus, shaped like a flattened seed pod, had been entombed beneath layers of magnetic shielding and Faraday mesh. Locked inside a vacuum-sealed chamber they called the quiet room. That morning, the room had not been quiet. Sensors failed first, not violently, just inaccurately. Temperatures displayed in negative Kelvin. Pressure readings looped back on themselves. Cameras developed subtle lens warping. Objects on the periphery began to shimmer. Some engineers believed they saw duplicates of their own arms. Others insisted their reflections blinked twice when they hadn't blinked at all. Then came the hum, not a mechanical sound. Not something that could be charted on a Hertz scale or described with clean sine waves. It pulsed like it had breath. But it was not audible in the normal way. Eardrums did not register it, but the mind did. Several researchers reported nausea. Others began coughing despite no airborne irritants. One collapsed from sudden onset vertigo, his eyes shaking side to side like a dial searching for a signal. Then came the dreams. All of them, later interviewed under sedation, described the same thing. Sinking, not into water but into light that behaved like water. A sensation of weight pulling them sideways. Bubbles rising downward, pressure building inside the chest. Not pain, not panic, just inevitability. In the dream, a voice spoke not in words, but in inflections, as if the sound had posture, tone without language, a shape made of vibration. The strangest part? The hum had no known electromagnetic profile, no field strength, no radiation, no waveform that conventional instruments could measure. It did not set off alarms or interfere with wireless signals, but it carved through human perception like a slow knife through warm fruit. One technician, a linguist assigned to study phoneme-like pulses from the craft's surface markings, began bleeding from his nose. His last recorded statement before losing consciousness was, "It's speaking, but not to us." The hum lasted 13 minutes. Then it stopped. Not faded, stopped. As if a hand somewhere had removed the needle from a spinning record. In the silence that followed, some reported a sensation of having just awoken from years of sleep. One woman claimed to remember a past life. Another couldn't recall her own middle name for several days. They shut the chamber down, reinstated lockdown procedures. The craft's surface remained warm for 3 hours. It had no onboard power. The file is marked non-local sonic field anomaly, but those who were there never called it that. They call it what it felt like. A warning, spoken through your bones, whispered from a place deeper than sound. They had spent decades calling it a craft. Even the most cautious officials clung to that term. A craft implied intention, a builder, a purpose, something that could be taken apart, studied, and, eventually, replicated. But late into the final phase of the investigation, long after the departments had been dissolved, long after the budget lines had been buried under layers of misdirection, one unsettling truth began to surface. It may not have been a vehicle. It may not have been a thing at all. At first, it was the material. It refused to fracture like metal. Lasers didn't cut it. Acids didn't eat through. Under high magnification, its surface behaved like skin that had been lacquered, but not dead skin, something closer to a living exoskeleton. It healed slowly over weeks. One technician left a scratch with a diamond filament probe, only to find it gone by the following month. They called it regenerative alloy, but that was a guess. They didn't want to call it what it really was, tissue. Inside the hull, if that word even applied, were channels once thought to be conduits for fuel or data. But their structure was eerily vascular. Fluid once moved through them, not oil, not plasma, something warm, something containing cells. Attempts to sequence it failed. The fluid crystallized instantly upon exposure to nitrogen. The frozen shards vibrated in a way that disrupted electrical equipment, almost like a frequency hiding in a solid. Then came the coils. Wound like tendons, these cords coiled in patterns reminiscent of muscle tissue, not wire. They tightened in the presence of static charge. One engineer touched it while walking across a carpeted chamber and was thrown back against the wall. He swore he heard a heartbeat right before it happened, a slow, patient thump. The control panel, or what they assumed was a panel, was less a dashboard and more a membrane. It responded to proximity, not pressure. It displayed no symbols, no lights, but it pulsed in rhythm with the technician's breathing. When another person approached, the pulses changed. Some speculated it wasn't reading them, it was sinking to them, like a parasite looking for a host. Months into this phase, a new hypothesis emerged, one no one wanted to voice, one that made the air in the briefing rooms feel thinner. What if the craft had not been built at all? What if it had been born? Reverse engineering became a misnomer. You don't reverse engineer a womb. You don't decode a spine. You don't imitate a heartbeat and call it propulsion. One team began referring to it not as the artifact, but as the being. Their lead researcher was reassigned after suggesting the craft might not be designed to travel space. It might be the space, a folded pocket of non-local awareness. A migratory entity that required no pilot because it was the pilot. And perhaps, more, records from that period grew strange, not just redacted, but overwritten. Logbooks with duplicated pages, with entries dated years before the program existed. Personnel who remembered working on systems that no longer existed, using tools they could no longer identify. A senior physicist began complaining that the object was dreaming, and worse, that the dream was leaking. The final note in the file, written in pen despite digital policy, reads, "We didn't salvage this. We didn't find it. We were introduced. No one speaks about it now. The materials are gone, supposedly destroyed, but a private contractor in Nevada recently filed a patent for a temperature-stable polymer that heals under microwave resonance. Another group in Argentina filed a claim for a bioconductive interface that requires no power source, only proximity to a human being. Their research cites non-reproducible legacy samples as the origin, and so the secret continues not as a lie, but as a seed. The truth was never that we copied alien technology. The truth was far older. It grew here, and it remembers. He had been slipping in and out of the morphine for 3 days. Sometimes he called out for names no one recognized. Sometimes he spoke in coordinates. But on the final night, when the nurse dimmed the lights and the oxygen hissed like a whisper trying not to be heard, he opened his eyes and said he was ready. His name was Alan, Colonel Alan T. Rivers. Retired United States Air Force, Tonopah Test Range, Groom Lake, Wright-Patterson, even 2 years unacknowledged in Diego Garcia. There were no medals on his bedside table. Just a photograph folded twice, once down the middle, once along the edge. The photo showed a strip of black desert and something faint in the sky. The ink had blurred from decades of finger oils, but he kept it anyway. I saw it once, he said. Over Tonopah, it was just hanging there, like someone poked a hole in the night, blinking like a wound. He didn't ask if the nurse believed him. He didn't care. The confession wasn't for anyone still walking around. It was for the thing itself. And maybe, just maybe, for whatever waited when the last breath left his chest. Back in 1978, they had moved the flights to nighttime only. No documentation, no photographs, no briefings to the Joint Chiefs. You either had clearance or you didn't. And even those who did were told nothing. You were given a call sign, you were pointed at the sky, and then you flew. That night, the air was static. You could feel it in your gums. Alan lifted off at 0300 sharp, assigned to shadow what was supposedly a new unmanned craft launched out of Groom Lake. But he never saw anything take off. He never saw a radar ping. No silhouette, just empty sky and the buzz of his own instruments. Then his HUD lit up, all at once. Not an object, but an absence. A void that flickered against the stars like it didn't belong in geometry. A sphere, but not quite. He couldn't explain the shape. He said it looked like a direction, not a structure. As if something had folded inward and forgotten to return to its original shape. He tried to bank left, but the plane fought him, not mechanically, not physically, but as if something was resisting him on a level he didn't have vocabulary for. It was watching me, he whispered, not with eyes, with memory. There was no panic, no alarms, just a slow, creeping understanding that whatever it was older. Not just older than the aircraft, older than the program, older than the desert. Something had been resting there, waiting to be remembered. When he landed, ground control didn't ask any questions. They escorted him to debrief, but there was no tape, no transcript, just 2 men with no rank, and a plane room with no flag. One of them slid a sealed envelope across the table and told him this never happened. Not just the sighting, his entire career at Tonopah. He was going to get a promotion, but it would be on paper only. His family would receive full benefits. He would never fly again. He signed. Years later, Alan began to see small patterns. He read about pilot deaths, listed as spatial disorientation, engineers relocated, and then quietly gone, patents sealed for national security. The same 5 words in every obituary, survived by no one. And then came the whisper. A phrase he heard in sleep, always in the same voice, always in the same cadence. We didn't build it, we borrowed it, and it wants it back. He had first said those words aloud in his sleep. His wife heard it. She told him the next morning, asking what it meant. He pretended not to remember, but he did. The thing above Tonopah wasn't an enemy craft. It wasn't Russian. It wasn't Chinese. It wasn't even from off-world, not in the way the tabloids meant. It had always been here, beneath the lake beds. Inside the caverns they said were formed by erosion. In the silos they thought were for missiles. He saw it once more, in a photo someone had smuggled out of a dig site. A perfect ring, a spiral of magnetized soil, birds that wouldn't fly over it, shadows that pointed in the wrong direction. Alan tried to forget. He tried to become a normal man. But every time he looked at a ceiling fan or watched a jet pass overhead, he wondered if he had seen a future that wasn't supposed to be seen. Because the thing never moved like a machine. It pulsed. It shivered. It responded. On his final day in uniform, he stood at the edge of a runway and felt the wind change. No planes were scheduled, no air traffic. But he knew. "It wants to go home," he said aloud. And no one heard him. Back in the hospice bed, the morphine drip had slowed. The machines were quiet. And Alan, 93 years old, lungs rattling like an old paper map, looked up at the ceiling and whispered it one last time. "We didn't build it. We borrowed it. And it wants it back." The nurse on duty that night, young, fresh out of training, said she saw something odd. Just for a second, when he passed, the lights in the room bent, just slightly, like heat off a highway, and the window, though closed, gave off a low sound, a thrum that made her teeth itch. She told her supervisor. The report was filed. But later, she looked for the form again and couldn't find it. The folder with Alan's name had been pulled, his effects removed. The folded photo gone. What he saw above Tonopah is not just a mystery buried in the desert. It is a question waiting to be answered. Not what it was, but why we ever thought it would let us keep it. Because if it was alive, then maybe it was not alone. And if it was watching us, maybe it still is. And maybe, just maybe, it never left.